If you are truly African, the question, who is an African, is not so relevant. Those who feel it know it. Being born or having one's roots in the mother continent is not sufficient to make one an African. One has to feel African. As the cradle of life and the starting journey of humanity, everybody can claim to be African. Even the racist apartheid architects called themselves African. The Arab countries of North Africa are full members of the various African continental and regional organizations, while they create exclusive Arab-only organizations like the Union of the Maghreb Arab. Who do you think is a real African? Our question today here on African Views is, who do you think is a real African? To help us debate just that, we have in studio Sbusiso Xaba. He's the president of the Pan-African Youth Congress. Also, Alistair Sparks, he's a journalist and political analyst. We welcome back Mr. Faith Isiak Pere, a filmmaker, and also Brother Buntu, the Secretary General of the Global African Congress. Now, before we start our discussion on our question, let's take a look at this insert first.
I am an African.
I am an African. Mina, ngum Afrika.
My name is Shaista. I am an African.
Kimushin Khatu, Kimu Afrika.
I am an African. I'm carved from the branch of the baobab and refreshed from the waters of the Nile. And it is below the equator where my ancestors chose to settle, where they chose to be African.
My name is Jessica. I am an African. Igama lami Jessica, ndigum Africa.
Kimi ngizithelezana, ngimu Africa.
I am Ali, and I am an African.
I am an African. From the shores of the east and St. Helena, they came to plant their seeds in the soil from which man first rose. They chose to smile under a sun of new hope, a sun of endless resource, and a son of God. They chose an African son.
I am an African.
My name is Minentlanene. I am an African.
My name is Shaista. I am an African.
Kimi ngizithelezana, ngimu Africa.
I am Ali, and I am an African.
Bizo lami ngingulunga and ngiyi-African.
I am Astrid van der Kerk and I am an African.
I'm Keenan and I am an African.
Igama lami Jessica, ndigum Africa.
I'm Lucian Ali. I am an African.
Ek is Wikus en ek is Suid-Afrikaner.
My name is Vincent Banja and
I am an African. Faith, tell us about the insert we just saw.
Okay, that insert is part of a promo to a global co-production, which we have been researching for 2.5 years globally, that the SABC and Moments Entertainment will be producing as part of the 5th World Summit on Media for Children in March next year. Mm-hmm. And it is the first time it's been done. We asked the question that, especially for young people, between the age of 13 to 16, when they are finding difficulty in identity, and for us, we thought it'd be very nice to have what I call a reunification of African children globally. So this is a multimedia global co-production that's got a television part, it's got a book, and it's got publication and podcasting and everything. It's the first time it's been done. And we're also working with producers all over the world, anthropologists as well, all over the world. And so it's the biggest thing that the SABC has embarked on, especially in the area of children and the African identity. And so that is a promo that's been going around.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen, welcome to African Views here on SABC Africa. The question is, who is an African? I'm going to go around the table. Are you an African, sir?
Definitely. And I belong to an organization, I'm Secretary General of Global African Congress, which actually has a definition, and how we define African people are people of African heritage. Obviously, you can have different approaches to defining an African, and I think sometimes it can be contextual. But if we look at some of the problems that many people of African heritage face globally today, there are times when it is important to identify people of African heritage and call that exclusively African, not to close off anyone else, but to be relevant about who is an African.
Faith, are you an African?
I have to be an African, and because I was brought up in London. Okay, especially London of the 60s. And if you could, you're not that old, Udi, so you won't remember London of the 60s. But as a child growing up in London, okay, of the 60s, it was very important to have your African identity. And that's what it's all about. And I remember that everything you were brought up with growing up in Africa, when you were transported into London in a concrete jungle, that Africanness went with you. So you'd be going down the street, you see a black person, any black person across the road. You cross the road to go and greet them, because that's how I was brought up. And so for me, you know, I didn't know how much of what being an African meant to me until I was removed from the continent.
Okay, Mr. Sparks, many are dying to hear your answer.
Why should that be a problem?
Are you an African? Not a problem at all. We're just waiting to hear.
Well, of course I'm an African, because I'm not anything else. I was born here, as was my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather on all sides of my family. So what else can I possibly be but an African?
Sbusiso.
And if you ask me beyond that, I will say, how do I know? I say, because my president told me so. My president made probably the finest speech he's ever made, and he made it in the South African Parliament as we were crafting our new constitution. And he made this brilliant speech, a wonderful piece of literature apart from anything else, in which he identified himself with every race group that had ever been in this country of South Africa. So I'm not only an African, I'm a South African. Although I've had problems with that as an identity factor, and maybe we can talk about that later.
Let's come back to that. Let's go to you first. Are you an African, sir?
Thank you. I'm proudly an African. Basically, an African, it's people of African indigenous being on the continent or anywhere in the world, and anyone who pays allegiance to Africa and have total loyalty to Africa and Africa only, and submit to the rule of the majority of African people, and assimilate to the cultures and the values of African people.
Mrs. Marks, you talked about the problems that you had with identification.
Well, prior to the liberation of this country, and I've written about this in several of books that I've written about South Africa, I certainly had no sense of pride in being a South African. I felt emotionally dissociated from my own country. And as I've written in those books, I describe myself as being, for the bulk of my life, and I'm now quite elderly, I felt emotionally stateless. But I knew where I belonged, and I knew what my commitment was. But I didn't walk about the world proud of being a South African. In the apartheid era, I had no wish to be associated with that. So for me, the transformation that took place in this country in 1994 was as much of a liberation as any black South African, of my fellow countrymen. Yeah. It was an enormous liberation, and I think on that day when I was present at the inauguration of Nelson Mandela at the Union Building Amphitheatre, and it was a very emotional occasion. And I think then, when I was already well into my 60s, I felt the first flicker of a strange emotion that I subsequently decided was probably patriotism. It was something I'd never felt in my life before.
Well
so
said.
I feel profoundly liberated by what has happened in our country and very proud now to be part of it.
You're watching African Views here on SABC Africa. We welcome your calls. I'll give you the number just after the break. What's your view? Are you there, caller?
Yes, I'm there. Hello.
Hi, hello. What's your views?
Yeah, I just have a comment for Mr. Alistair Sparks.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
please,
what does he
do me a
mean
favor.
when he says he's
turn down
African?
your, please just turn down your television set. You're giving us terrible feedback here in the studio.
Hello?
Yeah, just turn down your television set, please.
Okay, I just did that.
Thank you.
Okay?
Thank you very much. Go ahead. You were talking to Mr. Sparks.
Yes, I just have a question for Mr. Alistair Sparks. With a name like that and a skin color like that, I'm not a racist, but how do you call yourself an African? You're white. There are no white Africans.
Well, that's his view. That's
Tuvi,
his view. He's welcome to it,
right?
and I am untroubled by it. I don't know. I don't mind what anybody else regards me as being. I know what I am.
You wanted to
actually, whoever the caller is.
Tuvi from Nigeria, is it right? Tuvi? Tuvi. Okay, we lost Tuvi. Go ahead, Faith.
The creator of mankind, or humankind, is Africa. So every human being originated from Africa. Okay, whether you Caucasian, as Americans call it, or black like me, as you and I, Udi, this is where the cradle of humankind started here. And one of the things that we were actually doing during our research, during I Am an African in the US, was that whole thing. I would look at, quote, what they call Caucasian, and I would look at them and say, do you know that you're African? And they look at you, what do you mean? So that's why I'm very glad that somebody like Alistair is here, because see, Africa is also a state of mind.
I always do this to you when you're on African Views. I always interrupt you once you start getting on a roll. You're watching African Views on SABC Africa. We'll be right back. You're watching African Views here on SABC Africa. Thank you for being in our company, as we always do in this part of the show. We bring you the latest news from around the continent of Africa. After last week's clashes in the town Malakal, where at least 150 people died, Southern Sudan's President Salva Kiir has announced that militias will no longer be tolerated in there. Fierce fighting between former rebels from the south and Sudan's National Army broke out for the first time since the 2005 deal that ended 2 decades of war. Differences between President Laurent Gbagbo and his Prime Minister Charles Konan Benin over the implementation of Resolution 1721 continues to spark commentaries in the Ivorian papers A front page story in the privately owned daily L'Inter says the UN has summoned an emergency meeting following yesterday's decision to suspend all mediating parties. For the past 9 days, the ICRC has been working to help flood victims in central and southern Somalia, distributing essential items such as shelter material, blankets and mosquito nets. It has also been evacuating people by boat. It is reported from Zambia that Mr. Michael Sata, Zambia's opposition leader, has been arrested for allegedly making a false declaration of his assets before September's general elections. If he is found guilty of the charge, the Patriot Front party leader could face a minimum of 2 years in jail. With that, a quick look at what is making news headlines around the continent of Africa. Faith, let me start with you. Why the question that we just had from our first caller, based on the skin color of the gentleman next to you, Mr. Sparks, and like the caller said, with a name like that, I don't know what's wrong with your name, Mr. Sparks, no offense. Why do we still have that attitude on the continent?
Because, I mean, it's very easy, especially from young people, and the caller also sounds very young. The thing is that we have to look at Africa, being African, as just something away from skin color. Being African to me is your state of, is your mind, is your heart, you know. And there are many people born and bred in Africa. That's all they know. You know, that's all they know. It's the same thing as a black British. Okay, we'll say that the black British or the African American, because that is all they know. They can't say that you can't be British because you're not white. It's the same thing the caller saying that Alistair can't be African because he's not black. You know, so it's your state of mind. It's this, Alistair, this is where he was born. This is all he knows, as he said. You know, and I just use it as an example, the black British or the African American. You know, they are British first.
What's your take
on
it?
I actually have quite a different view, because I think that is actually exactly what is happening, that African people who grow up in Britain, France, Germany, they are not allowed, or they're not included in the definition of who is German, who is British, who is in America as well. America is predominantly white in its presentation and in how it operates and how it sometimes even define people in terms of power. We could go deeper to economy, we could go deeper into, and I think this is, you know, I'd like to have a romantic view of saying we are all one and we're just one human race and can't we just get all get along. I would love to do that, and I think that's where we need to strive to get to. But I also need to operate within a world that tells me that as a black person I'm different from a white person. I don't choose that, but that's the politics of my life. And I'm not clinging to a race definition as such, but I think we're still not at a stage where we as African people have fully liberated ourselves, understanding our culture, understanding how to operate within, even understanding freedom, because we're still in bondage in many ways. And I think until we get to that point, we cannot just dish out the African identity and just kind of say, you can be African now. In the same way, I cannot just wake up in China and say, you know what, I actually feel like I'm Chinese because I was born here and I just feel Chinese. I can feel that, and I agree that, you know, inside you can feel that I really relate to a certain culture, and this is how and I think there's also a difference between, you know, black people in Britain saying they are British, but I think very few would say they are European. And I think this is where it also gets a bit more complicated because we're talking about a continent. I do agree, yes, all humankind come from Africa. So originally, everyone is African. But I'm talking about a few things that happened on the way in our history that kind of made that a little bit difficult. And I refuse, not because I'm being ridiculous or whatever, but I refuse to just now nicely overstep that and say, well, just let's forget about that and let's pretend that we're all at an equal level. Because we're not. And as African people, black people are still striving to get to grips with understanding who we are, researching more about our culture, appreciating and loving who we are. I think only when we get to that stage, that's when we maybe can talk about, well, maybe we can now shift identities around a bit. But I think that's necessary.
The caller is coming from a perspective where the only thing we know is that as Africans, we've been oppressed by Europeans and before that Asians on this continent. So it becomes difficult to understand a sudden change of a situation where, let me say, people of European descent have always seen themselves as superior and always wanted to crush Africans. They always loved Africa, but they never loved Africans, basically. So
They
that's
love the continent, but not its people.
Not its people. The continent is rich. It's got what everyone wants. So everyone wants to identify with it, but they don't want its people. That's why in the definition of Africa, assimilation to the culture and assimilation to the values become very critical. You cannot just wake up in the morning and declare. It's not a matter of declaration, but it's a matter of taking hard steps. It's a matter of determined and working towards being an African. If you can look currently, how many people of Asian descent and European descent who are on the continent who speak African languages? They've got no interest. We as African people are supposed to assimilate to Europe 7,000 kilometers or 10,000 kilometers away from here. We have to assimilate to their culture, even when they're here. They identify with white supremacy Australia, white supremacy New Zealand, white supremacy America, than they identify with the continent. They see inferior, weak people who should be crushed, basically. That's where the color comes from. It's a serious problem that every youth in this continent struggle with when we start engaging on issues of identity.
So can I challenge that? Okay, what you just said, people identify with Western culture. Okay, half of our youth who we call black youth or African youth, they're doing that as we speak. You know, does that make them less African?
Please.
If I may come in.
By all means.
You know,
there's a misconception that youth is assimilating to American culture. Which American culture? There's a strength in that American culture. They identify with the hip-hop culture, which is African. Those Africans in America or in UK who puts their pens down and make them biggie, which is the same as what we do here, are not assimilated. That's not the norm of the American culture. It's a side culture that we identify with, because within its content, there is a drum in it which can definitely be identified with their African heritage, even when
Are you saying they're Africans as well?
Definitely they're Africans. In their thinking, in their identity, including in their oppression, when they're in Europe or in America, they are separated from those communities and they are oppressed in the similar way that were oppressed by colonizers here, directly or indirectly.
Mr. Sparks, come in there.
Well, you know, if somebody else wishes to impose an identity on me, then so be it.
That's their problem.
I know what I am. I don't have to apologize for my white skin. I can do very little about it anyway, and I'm certainly not going to apologize for it. I know what I feel, I know what I want to be, I know where I was born, I know where my heritage lies. If colleagues here want to put their identity or impose some other identity on me, well, go ahead, chum.
+271 714 8013. Please drop us an email, africanviews@sabc.co.za. Gentlemen, the two of you wanted to come in with a response.
Yes, you see, I think we're bringing too much politics into something that's got to do with identity. It's got to do with your state of mind, your heart, okay? Take South Africa, for instance, okay? I've lived in this country since 1990 for now 16 years, okay? As an African, I still find it very incredible how a majority of South Africa don't identify with being African. If they leave South Africa, they said, I'm going to Africa. you know? You see, yes. I'm just saying that let's not beat about the bush, okay? For me, being Africa is, as Alistair said, is your culture, your state of mind, and your heart, okay? And I think it's very important not to bring too much politics into it, because if we bring politics into it and bring race into it and bring colonization into it, then we're never going to get anywhere.
I would wish we could do that, but as we grow as African people, black people in this world, we become political statements. Once we walk into an audience where there's mostly white people, once we enter somewhere where we're not supposed to, those dynamics are still there, and we don't choose that they should be there or that there should be a value on skin color, but we operate in a world that if I'm teaching my child, I need to teach my child that is part of that child's identity training. He or she needs to understand that when she goes out or he goes out, her or his skin color matters. I can say that it doesn't really, but he will have to operate in a world where it does. That's why I'm saying that I see, and I don't want to debate this on an individual level, say you are not African, you are African, and just dish out. I have no right to do that. I mean, if you feel African, I'm not gonna quarrel with you. I'm just saying generally, as I operate in this world, I see when white people now all of a sudden storm up to the counter and say, I want to be African too. I'm also African. Yes, I want to be African now. They clearly didn't want to be that 10 years ago, and now it's kind of cool. And I just feel that
you're talking about all whites.
You're talking
about all whites. You're talking about all. You are generalizing in a racist fashion.
No, it's not a racist fashion. I'm talking about how I operate in this world. And if you think that is too radical or whatever, that is your problem. I'm just saying how I see the world and how I operate in. And of course, that is informed of how the world is teaching me about my blackness, about my Africanness. And of course, that's how I see the world. Of course, but I'm just saying that my friend is saying we shouldn't politicize it. I don't want to politicize it, but I'm living in a world where skin color is very politicized, and it forms identity. We cannot say, well, blackness is over here and African is over here. It is part of one and the same.
African Views at sabc.co.za.
I'd like to respond to that.
Mr. Sparks,
yes.
when we come back from the break, please.
Okay.
+2711 714 8013. You're watching African Views on SABC Africa. You're watching African Views here on SABC Africa. Isaac, what's your view?
My view is this, that this question about there being Africans of white origin, we've got to say one thing. If you look at South Africa for the start, South Africa is a Eurocentric state, it's a Eurocentric nation. White people used to become Africans the day they used to step down from the Union Castle at the Cape Town dock or the Durban dock. And the problem is this, that these people are not being assimilated to Africa. We as Africans, as Mr. Prada said, we have been oppressed. We Africans have been slaves for over 1,000 years. And we have actually, our culture has actually been put down. South Africa being white South Africans, they have never assimilated as Africans. They have never accepted themselves as Africans. And right now they've got access to dual citizenship. Mr. Alistair can apply for British citizenship tomorrow, and he's going to get it. He has got a right to return to Britain, not as a British, as a Briton. He is a Briton. The Asiatics of South Africa, they're also crying for dual citizenship with India. You've got problems of the Indian mosaic. South Africa is home to any other race in the world but the African people themselves. But it's high time that basically we actually define our Africanness. People are going to call themselves Africans. They've got to define their Africanness. I think that's a very important thing. Thank you.
Thank you for your view. Mr. Sparks, I promise to come back to you.
Well, I'm hearing a lot of remarks here saying that all whites have been oppressors in Africa, including in perhaps specifically South Africa. This is absolutely untrue. a great many white folk, and not least here in South Africa, and going way back in history, fought very hard for the liberation of black people. And I would argue that it takes a particular kind of courage for somebody to stand up and fight and perhaps give his life